In this lesson, we'll see how we can start to incorporate things like transparency and reflectivity into our Softimage materials. Okay, so as you start to work in Softimage and begin building up your textures and materials, there are any number of situations where you'll need to have objects in your scene that may be reflective or transparent and refractive. So let's take a look at where we can start to incorporate some of these effects, and we'll start to incorporate these into our windshield here. So the first thing we need to do is give our windshield a special material. So we can use the same Fong or blend that we've been using up to this point. In my case, I'll just use the Fong. Now, to actually start to see any of these transparency effects, we'll first need to make sure we actually draw out a render region, or make sure that we are rendering in some form, so these effects will not be seen in the actual viewport itself. But let's start by actually going to our Fong material for the windshield, and let's go into this Transparency and Reflection tab. Alright, so at the moment you can see transparency is something that we have enabled, but right now our transparency is set to 0. So in other words, it's completely opaque. Now if we want to start increasing our transparency, we can start to dial these values up. So in my case, I'll just press and hold the Control key on my keyboard and slide all of these sliders at the same time. And what we should start to see is that as we start to dial these up, we begin to see some transparency start to show up in this actual material. Now, at the moment, you can see that it is just simply transparent. There's really no level of refraction to it, which really is not what we would expect to see in real life. Typically, anything that has some level of transparency also has refraction to it. In other words, it can actually start to alter the direction of the light that passes through it. So, if we start to increase this index of refraction, right now it's set to 1, which basically means that there is no refraction that happens. A refractive index of 1 is basically what you get with air. Now typically, as we start to dial this up, typical refractive index of glass is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5. And what we should start to see now is we can actually start to alter what is seen through this glass. And you can now start to see a little bit of that distortion, which is typically what we would expect to see in real life. Now, if we had a situation where we wanted to get maybe a frosted glass look or something that wasn't completely transparent, we can start to increase this frost amount. Now, this might be a little bit easier to see if I were to actually take my transparency all the way up to white, so that way it is completely transparent with no fogginess whatsoever. So we can come in and start to increase this frost amount. Now, as we start to dial this up, we really shouldn't see any difference at all. That's because this frost will not have any effect until we also start to increase the number of samples. So I'll start by taking the number of samples up to something like 1. Now if you look very closely, we can start to see now a little bit of noise starting to appear in here. Now this might be a little bit easier to see now if we start taking this frost up to a higher value. And now you can start to see where this again starts to become a little bit foggier and a little bit softer. So the higher this frost level, the blurrier everything will start to become on the other side of this glass. Now, you'll probably start to see quite a bit of noise starting to appear, and that's really what this samples controls. So as we start to dial the samples value up and bring this a little bit higher, we should start to see this noise level start to reduce quite a bit. Although the thing to keep in mind is that the higher this number of samples, the slower your render times will start to become. So as I start to dial that up, again, we see these blurrier and blurrier effects behind this glass. So if I were to take the samples or the frost, either one of these values back to 0, we should get this nice, clear, transparent glass once again. Now below this transparency area, we also have reflection. Now the reflection works in very much the same way. You'll see a lot of these same parameters between this transparency and the reflection. So again, first thing we might need to do is take this reflection, press and hold the Control key on my keyboard and start to gradually bring this up. Now, in my case, it's probably going to be difficult to start to really see any kind of reflection because there's really nothing up here to actually be reflected. So what I might do, just for the sake of demonstration, is to maybe just drop in a very simple primitive object, maybe just a simple grid, and just move this up and out of the way. There we are. And now you'll notice that because this piece of geometry has a shader on it that is entirely transparent, you notice that that object no longer shows up in the viewport. So sometimes you have to be careful because you may initially think that your object has disappeared. It's still there, it's just that it is now completely displaying that transparent shader. So let's once again come in here and get to our material. A quick way of doing that is to either go back to your material manager, or we can just Alt right click and go to Inspect Material. There we are, and very quick and easy way of jumping back in there. So let's once again draw out our render region. There we go. Now once again, as we start to increase this transparency level, we should start to see some of these objects beginning to appear in here, so we can start to see a very subtle reflection of our piece of geometry. And it's still a little bit difficult to see though, so again, maybe just for the sake of demonstration, I'll take that grid and let's go to Get Material. And right now, it's using a material that is probably pretty difficult to see on the underside. You can see that's exactly what we have here. So to make this nice and bright, I'll go ahead and go to Get Material, and I'll use something like a constant material. So with this constant, we get something that is now almost luminous and nice and bright. We'll talk a little bit more about this in one of our later lessons. So now that should make this very easy to see within the reflections of our object. So once again, I'll draw out my render region. Now we can really see that reflection starting to happen within this piece of glass here. So once again, I can grab that glass, Alt right click, Inspect Material, and again we can start to dial this transparency, or this reflection rather, up or down. So if we wanted this to be a little bit less transparent, we can do that. We also have the ability to control the gloss and the sampling. So if we actually wanted to have some blurred reflections in here, we can start to dial that up, and you can see where we start to now smooth out some of these reflections and start to kind of blur that out. Again, just keep in mind that as we start to increase the gloss and the samples to higher values, again, our render times will start to slow down pretty noticeably. So once we start to get into some of our later lessons where we actually begin setting up an environment and actually start to have something around for this glass to start to reflect, this should start to look much, much better. So for now, what I'm going to do is take my samples and my gloss and bring those both down to 0. Make sure that things are moving nice and quick for now. And I'll go ahead and leave this reflection set to somewhere kind of in the halfway value, about 0.5. We can always come back and adjust that at a later point if we need to. But for now, I'll go ahead and leave, again, these settings sort of as they are. So that's really just a quick look at how we can start to come in here and add some of these reflective and transparency type effects into any of our materials.